Good morning. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 50. I'm going to be honest, we're actually going to be in Genesis chapter 37 through 50 today. I'm not going to read the entire text, but we're going to give you the story as we go through it. But I'm going to pick up just in Genesis 50, starting in verse 15, as our key passage. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was not intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives, so then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly. Can we pray together? God, would you open our ears that we could hear, open our minds so that we can receive, so that we can set aside any preconceived ideas or false narratives that we have intentionally or unintentionally embraced that stand in the way of the truth of you today. And then would you give us a willing heart, a heart that is not bound by hearing or by listening, but one by doing. May we never be consumers more than we are contributors, and may we never be hearers more than we are doers. May we have an obedient response to your word. We love you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. You know, there's a lot of talk about like what generation you fall into, right? We got millennials, we have Gen Z, we got Gen X, we got boomers, we got all these different generations. And I don't know about you, but I've taken like 1,000 different tests, even though I know what generation I am, because I just feel like I don't fit within it. Anybody else, you read about yours and you're like, nope, I fit in a different one. There's actually supposedly like a sub-generation that actually is the years I was born, which makes me feel a little more honest. But I've actually found the generation I belong to without finding it through these definitions. And the generation I belong to is called the walk it off generation. I just made that up, but if I heard anything in my life growing up, it was walk it off, right? Like, walk it off, you'll be fine, like, pick yourself back up, like, you're going to be all right. And I'm going to be honest, as a walk it off generation kid, I think there's some truth in that, right? Some things in life, you just got to walk it off. You got to get up, you got to keep moving forward. But if we're not careful, we will start to apply the same ideology to areas that we can't walk off, right? My mom told me as a kid one time, so my brother was getting on my nerves. My brother's 6 years older than me. My sister's 3 years older than me. I'm the baby. I was about 5, maybe 6 years old. We were living in, where were we? I guess in Prattville at the time, maybe. I'm not sure. He was watching TV. He just did this. He was watching TV. He just did this, and I went flying past him, okay? I hurt my foot when that happened, and I went to my mom, I was like, I hurt my foot, and she's like, what were you doing? I was like, none of your business, and she was like, walk it off, and I walked it off. I kept complaining about it, and she was like, you'll be fine. Finally, like 2 days later, because that's about how often we took baths, 2 days later at best, my mom was getting me ready for a bath, and she undid my shoe and realized that my shoelaces were imprinted on my foot, because I had broken my foot in 3 places when I jumped off the bed to kick my brother. Kids in the room, let it be a lesson to you. If you try to kick your brother in the back, you're going to break your foot in 3 places, okay? Walking it off wouldn't work in that situation. Walking it off actually made it worse in that situation, right? Walking it off is something that we do when it is something that we're more embarrassed about or something like that more than it is a physical thing. And I just want to say this when it comes to our mental health for just a moment. Trauma, whether it came from betrayal, abuse, tragedy, chronic pressure, whatever it is, I need to hear you hear this. If you wouldn't say walk it off to a broken leg, don't say suck it up to a wounded mind and heart. People are hurting, and we just keep pushing it down as far as we can, right? Actually, look at the statistic. 70% of adults in the U.S. have experienced at least one traumatic event in their life. 70%. In Joseph's story, which I just read part of, we see a man whose life was marked by traumatic events, yet redeemed by God. So today, we're in this series, Held Captive. We're talking about mental health and faith. And our key passage during this comes from Paul's writing to the church of Corinth. We say it every week. He tells them that we demolish arguments and pretensions, things that set themselves up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Paul is saying, I've taught you about the nature of who God is. I've shown you who he is. And now that you know the truth about God, when lies come within your life, you can take them captive and make them bow to God instead of making Christ bow to your life. But the truth is we are more often held captive by our thoughts than we are holding our thoughts captive. So we're going to do the exercise we've done every week. We only got one more week after this to do it. You're going to repeat after me, and you're going to say it with your whole chest. You ready? Ben is still learning. You said that too confidently, and it made me very not feel good about myself, but it's okay. Now I'll say this. Ben is not a therapist. Yeah, that's true. I'm not one. I'm not a willing to walk with people in their suffering when he doesn't. Willing to walk with people in their suffering when he doesn't. The path, though, to wholeness is not always easy, but I promise you it's worth it. God desires you to be made whole. So before we start, I think you need a joke this morning. Do you want a quick joke? Yes, we need one. And those who said no, I don't think you heard. You were asleep during the first half. We're about to talk about trauma today. Would you like a joke before we do? Yes. It's the only lighthearted part of it. So I was riding with an Uber driver not long ago, and I tapped him on the shoulder to tell him something. But when I tapped him on the shoulder, he swerved all over the road. He almost hit the car next to us, and then he stopped inches before hitting a shop window. And man, after we all caught our breath, I just said, dude, you're super jumpy, aren't you? And he goes, I'm sorry. He goes, it's my first day being an Uber driver. And I'm like, oh. And he goes, but I've been driving a hearse for 20 years. Some of you will get that in a minute. Nobody tapped him on the shoulder in his last job, right? Okay, good. Those who didn't get it, you'll get it lunchtime. They'll tell you. I want to tell you a story this morning, not just about trauma, but also just about... Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Israel being Jacob, okay? That gets a little confusing in our world today. Because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. So he was his favorite, he was his miracle baby, and he has this ornate robe for him. And the robe was a symbol, a visible sign that Joseph was chosen. But to his brothers, it wasn't a sign that he was chosen, it was a target. A reminder that they were not chosen. So one day Joseph went out to find his brothers in the fields, but they didn't greet him with brotherly love. It says, so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing. They took him and threw him in the cistern, the well is what it was. The well was empty and there was no water in it. This wasn't a prank. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, listen, my kids do this to themselves every day. This wasn't boys just being boys. This was them betraying him. They ripped his robe, the very thing that made him feel known, made him feel loved, and then they threw him in this pit. Now he was alone, abandoned, and rejected. But they didn't leave him there, actually. No, they didn't. They got him out, not to save him, but to sell him. Verse 25, they sat down to eat their meal. They looked up and they saw a kid after the fact. And now imagine this, though. Listen, imagine the ache of being sold by your own blood. It wasn't the moment that he was sold that was the trauma. It was the continuation of the knowledge that your brothers have betrayed you, that you have been sold by your own blood. Imagine watching your brothers walk away while strangers pull you towards a foreign land. They faked that death of Joseph to their father as well. It says when he took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this, examine it and see if this is your son's robe. Joseph, now a slave in Egypt, finds himself in the home of someone named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. And even there, in this unfamiliar, unfair place, God was still with him. That's a good thing to remember. We're going to skip to chapter 39. It says that the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Does that make his trauma disappear? Yes or no? No. Is he sitting in a better place than he was prior to his trauma? Yes. Does it make it any easier? No. The trauma doesn't. The once covered in dirt and shame is now clothed in royal robes, second in command over all of Egypt. Chapter 41. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And then comes this moment that no one saw coming. Famine hits the land. Joseph's brothers, the same one who's betrayed him, now come to Egypt to buy food because they have no food. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And Joseph reveals who he really is. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Can you imagine that silence? That tension? The flashbacks, but Joseph doesn't retaliate. What does he do? He's going to do something that is foreign to our concepts today, which is he forgives. He weeps. And then he says this, verse 20 of chapter 15. You, my brothers, intended to harm me, but God intended for good to be accomplished, what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph was sold into slavery. Trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. It comes actually from a Greek word, and usually when I tell you the Greek word, I have to work really hard at pronouncing it right, but the Greek word for trauma is really interesting. You know what it is? It's trauma. It's a Greek word that means to wound or to pierce. And there's three types of trauma. I don't know if there's three types. There's three different types of trauma that mental health experts have defined them and classified them as. Number one is called acute trauma, which is a response to a single distressing event that overwhelms somebody's ability to cope. So an example of this would be a car accident, a natural disaster, tornadoes, earthquakes, assault, witnessing violence, sudden loss of a loved one, something like that. Let me give you a staggering statistic to me when it comes to acute trauma. More than 1 in 4 children, over 25%, have witnessed violence in their home, school, or communities in the past year. In 2009, I'm sure it hasn't changed much since then. There's been an acute trauma within 1 in 4 students that we know for sure when it comes to violence alone in that. The second type of trauma is called chronic trauma, which is a repeated or prolonged exposure to the distressing events. So a good example of this would be like long-term abuse, whether it be emotional, physical, or sexual, right? Domestic violence, ongoing neglect, growing up in a home with addiction, growing up in a severe poverty, growing up in settings of racism that goes towards you. And by the way, same study as earlier I quoted, but 10% of children are exposed to domestic violence. This trauma changes how you see ourselves, how we see God, how we see others, and how we see our future. It changes how we view life, even if life doesn't change. Even if circumstances and seasons look the same, we view them differently. We see this when someone grew up in poverty and had plenty now, but they still have a fear that there's never going to be enough. You ever met anybody like that? Anybody know somebody who grew up in the Great Depression? And they have stuff that's expired for months in the cabinets? And you go to them and you're like, hey, this is expired by years. And they know that it's expired. They know they can't consume it. They know they have enough money to buy it, but there's something about them that can't let it go. That's because of that, right? Right. No matter if it's acute, chronic, or complex, we are held captive by our trauma. These three types of trauma are not classifications of severity, but more of a categorization in order that we can treat all trauma, because not all trauma can be treated the same. All trauma can lead, though, to the prison of being held captive. And the truth about trauma is this, and this is where we really get off, and I'm not a therapist, but we get off track here when we do this. When we try to treat all trauma the same, and especially not just treating it the same, but when we treat trauma as if it is someone who just won't do something. Like somebody who's had traumatic experience in their life, it's not that my grandmother wouldn't throw away the canned goods. She can't. There's something in her that can't. It's not that trauma won't, it's that trauma can't. And that's really hard for us to comprehend because I grew up at least, in a walk it off generation. But you know what's really good news for us as believers? Because I'm your pastor, I'm not a therapist. So I got to be a little pastoral for a second. The good news about trauma can't is that as believers, the good news for us is that when we can't, he can. When we're weak, he's strong. Paul wrote to the church of Corinth, and he talked about this thorn in his side, something that we don't know fully what it was, but we know that it impaired his everyday life. He begged God to get rid of it. It says that 3 times he wrote to the church of Corinth, I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change your future, but it does not also change that my grace is enough for all things. The trauma isn't outside the goodness of God. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, Paul says, I can boast the more gladly in my weakness. I can actually speak to you as a church in Corinth, he says, about my weakness. Why difficulties? You're talking about a man who caused lots of trauma for people. Persecuted Christians, and later was heavily persecuted, imprisoned. Then the Lord, find the Lord as the lifter of the lowly. Find that the Lord had been ripped off of Joseph, and he may have felt that as a sign of his identity. Been ripped off of Joseph, and he may have felt that as a sign of his identity being gone. But do you remember the end of the story? Here he sits in a robe there, God realigning who his identity is. The Lord was with Joseph, so he prospered, and he lived in the house of the Egyptian master. When the master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did. By the way, I'm not belittling the things that I or you have faced. I'm telling you that the path to wholeness is not easy, but it's worth it. Why does God want us to know this? Because healing happens when we stop reliving the pain and start retelling the redemption. Joseph didn't deny what had been done to him. He actually named it. He said, you intended to harm me. But he also reframed it through the knowledge of God's goodness. He looked at his scars and he saw a possible purpose, not just the pain it had created. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he popped them in the nose. No, he said, I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Say hello to my little friend. I don't know. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourself for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. I won't go into many stories of my trauma because we have a video that I talk about that in a second a little bit. But I lost my father when I was 7. He was younger than me. My sister's 3 years older than me. My brother was 3 years older than her, and we all processed that differently. I lost my best friend Heath when I was 12 to a car accident. It still shakes me to this day. I've had other traumatic moments along the way, and then about 6.5 years ago, after being in ministry for 15 plus years full time, I experienced some hard a mixture of religious trauma, church trauma, and work trauma all combined. And I don't tell this to many people, but now that we're kind of in the clear, I could be honest with you. Maybe I wasn't honest in the beginning. If you've been with us since the beginning, when we planted Collectivist Church, it was done out of trauma in a lot of ways. I had seen the underbelly of what the Western church could be in its most unhealth, and I didn't want to be a part of that, but I knew I had a calling on my life as a pastor, so I made a deal with God. Don't make deals with God, by the way. It's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. He always comes out winning somehow. I said, God, I'll plant a church, but I want to remove every opportunity for it to succeed if I have to do it the way that the church is being built currently. I'm not a CEO. I'm not a good leader. I'm not the head of an organization. I'm none of those things. And I learned some of those skills, but that was exhausting to me. And I think for me at least, I saw it lead to a lot of more unhealth than health. And so I said, God, if I can't plant a church that is simple, that makes disciples of all nations, that welcomes all people to the Father's table, that teaches the Bible well and full all the way through, that learns to put people in lifelong community and not semester-based communities, but oikoses, as Scripture would call it, and living on mission to be your hands and feet. If we can't just do those things and it succeed, I want it to fail. We had multiple denominations approach me, because I've been in ministry for a long time, offer us lots of money to plant. And it wasn't because I had a theological difference with them. It wasn't because I don't agree with denominations. We said no to those things because I didn't want it to succeed if it was meant to fail. That was it. We wanted to remove every safety net. We didn't align with any organizations, good or bad. Why? Because deep down inside, I'll be honest with you, I wanted it to fail if it wasn't going to work. And I'm thankful today to look around and to realize that not only did it work, but I believe, and you're going to think I'm an exaggerator here, but I truly believe it's my heart, that I get to pastor the greatest church that's ever existed. Not ever existed. We'll go back in history, but today. We'll say today. You might not compete with the early church, but you're pretty close. Okay? I do. My family's thankful for it. My faith is thankful for it. I know many of you are thankful for it. And that's because God wasn't done. I told God after that last situation, I'm done. And the most clear I've heard him, I haven't heard him very clearly like this many times, I heard him say, I'm not done. And I don't think he was actually even talking about my life. I think he was talking about the lives of those in this area. Because I actually don't live here. I don't know if you know that. I live in Hoover. I planted in Calera because it's the most unchurched county in Shelby County. And I was ready to go home and live my Hoover life. I don't know what that means, but we'll just call it a Hoover life. But instead, God said, I'm not done. Because when I'm weak, he's strong. So what's God want us to do? Well, we'll start this, then we're going to hop to the video, and then we'll hop right back in. Number one, face the wound. When I say face the wound, we're talking about that Greek word trauma. Face the wound, the piercing. Reveal that which is hurt. We've started 2 weeks ago talking about anxiety, last week talking about depression, and we kind of said the same sentence every time, but replaced a word, because it's really true about most mental health areas. Silence about trauma or silence about depression doesn't lead to healing, right? So what does lead to healing? God, of course. But the first step is you have to be honest in order for it to lead to healing. A reminder for those a reminder to those who call Collectivist home, but some new information if you're new here. We believe this with all of our hearts. It's almost a purpose statement for us. It'd be a weird purpose statement, but it really is so common for us to say this, that your questions will not break God. And I say that over and over because many of us have had something established and sown within our life when it comes to churches that we're told there's certain questions you can't ask. I want you to know there's no question you can't ask here, not one. It might break other churches. It will not break God, and I believe it won't break us. And I'm willing for us to be broken if it's because of questions. These questions need an ear to listen, though, is the problem. So what I want to tell you is do not face the wound alone. Like, I want you to talk about it. I want you to expose it. I want you to bring it to light. 3 ways. These aren't new. These are kind of, over the last couple of weeks, we talked about something similar. Number one, I would expose the wound to God. That's my calling for you, is to let you know that you can bring everything to God in prayer. This might be your first step, and God is not far from you in your trauma. Look at verse 21. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. The second thing I would say is you should expose the wound to a friend or to community or to someone else. And by the way, this might be the hardest step. But then after this, I wouldn't stop until I've done the third thing, and that's as I was to expose the wound to a mental health professional. By the way, I'm going to say this out loud. You might want to take a picture of this one up there or write it down. Let it hang for a second before we go to the video. You don't have to process your trauma with everyone, and you probably shouldn't. But you do have to process it with someone. In other words, I'm not asking you to make a Facebook post about your trauma. You can, if you choose to. Don't get mad when new trauma comes and you don't get a lot of likes on it, right? Right? Not saying you can't, but I'm saying maybe it's not for everybody, but it is something you have to process with someone. Start with God, add a trusted friend, and let mental health professionals guide you as well. I believe that this with all my heart, that this is not weakness, this is wisdom to do this. And so I want you to watch this quick video. It's not quick, 20 minutes, and I'll wrap up, and we'll send you out of here. Hey family, it's Pastor Ben. I'm sitting with my friend Sarah Bowman. We are 3 sessions in, so now she's my real friend. Like we're friends. I might even add her on Facebook later. Maybe I don't know. We'll see. She is a counselor, runs Sarah Bowman Counseling, works with children, adults, all across the world. I mean, all across you can too. All across the different mental health things. Also has a background in spiritual formation, seminary degree in that. So what a great day to talk about where faith, mental health intersect. And I think we're going to talk about one today that is going to have a mixed view a little bit probably. I think lots of people have an opinion on it. Like many things, people have used mental health and even these different things to make either or statements like we talked about, right?
Yeah.
But we see it even politicized a little bit, like we see it just, I don't know, used for other agendas outside of the health of it. I think today might be the bigger one. We've talked about anxiety, we've talked about depression. I feel like that's been in our vocabulary for a while. I think no matter your thoughts on it, like you've heard those phrases probably since everyone here was at least a kid, if not before then. But there's kind of one that I wouldn't call it new, but it's getting used as a term more. And I think we probably have just different views on what it is, and that's the area of trauma. And my family has been impacted by trauma, me personally, from losing my father at a young age to losing my best friend at a young age, to a lot of church trauma, which is what we see at our church a lot. We have a lot of church hurt people that took a lot for them to step across the threshold of a church again. I have my own church hurt. I mean, Collectivist Church was my last attempt to know if I even believed in what the church was becoming and as that bride that Jesus talks about. And so I think trauma's here, but let's kind of take off some of the negative stereotypes of what it is, and let's kind of talk about, so how do you define, I'm not saying this is a full definition, like what would you define trauma as? And then after that, what does that trauma look like to my brain and my body possibly? And again, I know that can look a little different in everybody, but so let's just start with that. Like, what is trauma? Like, give me a thought on what that is.
So to give you my most basic definition, I'll tell you what I say with my kids that come in that have a history of trauma, and they're coming for counseling, and they're sitting with me maybe on the floor, and you know, I'm like, okay, well, you know, what's brought you here today? And they're like, something really scary happened. And I'm like, yes, something really scary happened to you, something really big and really scary. And it's still bothering you today, isn't it? And they're like, yeah, it is. And I'm like, how is it bothering you? And now each person, how trauma affects each person is different. It affects each person differently, depending on just that person, their personality, their history, their context, their biological makeup, and also actually what the event was. So the way that research is kind of going now is we used to think of trauma as one really distressing, significant event that was disturbing, and now as trauma is becoming more, not normalized, we don't want to normalize trauma, but like talked about more openly is what I mean by that. And more like kind of interwoven into popular culture and, you know, social media, things like that. We're realizing that trauma is more than just one event, that it can be multiple events over time. We call that developmental trauma, complex trauma. So depending on your type of trauma, what happened, and also what kind of resources and supports you had in that moment.
In the moment of that trauma.
That's going to affect how it continues to stay with you or not.
And also just where you are in life too, age, right? So a great example, our therapist was talking to us about a situation in our family was, she said, I'm gonna give you an example, and I'll let you speak into this. She said, if a mom, let's say a mom and 3 kids were driving in a car, they were going down the road, kids are 18, 12, and 5. Or let's go younger than that, sorry, let me back that up. Let's go nonverbal, so like 1, whatever, 5 and 12, okay, and mom, and they get a car accident. Everybody's fine in the end, but I mean, it was a pretty big accident. Years later, when driving by that same spot, all of them have processed that traumatic event differently. The one that was nonverbal at the time, which is something we deal with in our family, is trauma that happened prior to being able to verbalize those things. often doesn't know why they feel the way they feel when they drove by there.
Which is also very scary.
Yes, very
To not know
scary.
how to-
And they're like going past just a place in the road that all of a sudden their body is overwhelmed and they're having a response physically and mentally that is out there. Where then the older kids have a different way to be like, you remember that time we drove by this and this happened, and still has their own trauma to that. And then mom, who maybe it was a lesser of a trauma, for like, and I'm not trying to hierarchy these things, but like, it's just
Right.
like where we were in life can also change a little bit of that. So how does trauma present in someone? Like what, like I know that's probably multiple ways as well, but what are some ways like today if I'm trying to say maybe I have some unapproached trauma in my life, like how is that presenting in my life? How can I know that?
So a big conversation right now in the research in the mental health world is how the body stores trauma. So the thing is our brains store trauma a certain way, but it also lives in our nervous systems and in our muscles and in our physical movements. Like it lives, it happened and it lives in our physical body. So the way we can sometimes know that, oh, I have some unprocessed or unresolved trauma is it shows up in our bodies. That may be the first thing that comes up. So it may be panic attacks. It might be depression. It might be you're walking past a certain type of person and you see that person and all of a sudden you feel you're shaking, you're sweating, you feel very fearful but you're not sure why. It's because you have these implicit memories, so these memories that are stored in your brain that haven't been quite brought to the surface yet and made sense of, which is kind of the work of therapy, to be honest. So that's, I think, the first signal that a lot of people have is these physical symptoms of feeling out of control, feeling anxious, feeling afraid, which a lot of times leads to what we call avoidance. So then you start to avoid that thing that scares you, but you don't even know why you're scared of it, but you know you're going to avoid it so that you don't feel that uncomfortable feeling of being scared. So a lot of people with trauma will come to counseling saying, like, I can't even go to the gym because when I get to the parking lot, I'm so anxious, or you know what, I can't even go to church anymore. I get to the parking lot and I start shaking uncontrollably, and even though my partner is with me or my friend is with me, like I can't. I'm too afraid to go in the doors because I see the building and I feel that, and so I'm just not going to go to protect myself. Does that make sense?
100%. Yes, that's great. You talked about earlier about healing happening not in isolation, but with other people. So why is community maybe kind of essential in some of this recovery? Obviously, getting mental health professionals, but how can other people be helpful for that? Like, you can even go on a faith side if you like to, or stick in the clinical side.
Yeah, I mean, it's both and,
yes,
right?
Both and.
For a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people. So remember I said the thing about how trauma is stored in your body and your brain, and sometimes what our brains do, because God made them this way, and our brains want to protect us from things that feel overwhelming, is without even consciously doing it, our brain will suppress these memories. And sometimes what's most healing is bringing the trauma out of darkness into the light.
Yeah, you can't hide what's in the light. Yeah, that's good.
And so sometimes even just saying it out loud, I've heard people say like that, telling my story to another person and it being seen.
Oh yeah.
Was my first step to healing, and it was a big step. It opened the door for all the rest of the healing that I did. So trauma likes to stay hidden and in the dark. And so I think bringing it out into the light in the community of safe,
yes.
trusting.
Yes. We don't want to cause more trauma.
Being discerning of that, and when that feels right for you and safe for you, has a way of disarming the trauma, and then kind of is a first step to a lot of healing for people.
Yeah, one of the things I see in community, and I don't have a better way to explain it than this. It's not that it's a bad way. We saw it. I used to talk about it as the Me Too before we had like the Me Too movement, which was dealing with survivors of sexual abuse and things like that. And it was people saying me also. But a lot of times it takes bringing something out that can also help other people as well. And so that happens in our faith. Like when I do discipleship and things like that, I like to do it in communities. A lot of people think, oh, discipleship, you do it one-on-one. I like to do it with 3 or 4 people because I can be talking to somebody and they can answer something a certain way that the other person felt the same but didn't have the words for, right? And they can be like, you know what? I didn't know how to say that, but like, me too. And that's really what's made me even have these conversations as a church, is like, I want them to know they're not alone, and even that their pastor wrestles with this, not because I'm trying to be like some, oh, listen, he's like cultural, talking about mental health, but like, no, I want you to know, like you're allowed to say, like, me too, like, that's what I walked through, and if he can say that, then I can get help for that too. And so I like that, not just for your healing, but you could also be helping other people heal by sharing your trauma with a safe environment of people as well.
Trauma has a way of making you feel like you're the only one that's ever been through, because it's so big and overwhelming. You're like, surely there's no one that's ever felt the way I feel.
Yeah.
And the thing is, your trauma is your trauma. Your story is your story.
100%.
No one's been through what you've been through in your
100%.
body with your personality. But there is a way to connect with others who understand at least part of it.
Yep.
And that can be really freeing for people.
So why is it, and this will probably be, you spoke to it a little bit, but like, why is it that like trauma does stick with us? Because you're talking about that, like, where is it stored in your body? That's an interesting thought. I don't know if I've ever heard that phrase. Like I look back, I still have some religious trauma, maybe work trauma, I don't know what you'd call it, because I was working in ministry from a church position that like I feel totally healed from. But the other day I had to stop in the town that this had happened and drive by the same things, and I got that like anxious shakes and like I'm pastoring literally my favorite church in the world. We're doing what we love. I've like extended forgiveness to where I felt like I was hurt, dropped offenses within my life, done all these spiritual things. Like, so why does trauma linger even after we've moved on? Is there anything, like any insight to that?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
I know part of it, I think about what I talk about with friends and clients and, whoever. Whoever wants to talk about trauma, is that what happened to you, you can undo it.
Right.
It doesn't go away.
Yeah.
And so in therapy, I'm not going to sit there and say, let's get you to a place where you never have to think about it or it never bothers you. But it's about walking with people hard moments.
Yeah, which is interesting. And so we're always trying to put it into how do we get out of grief? How do we get out of trauma? Instead of like, how can I be healthy and get out of trauma? Instead of like, how can I be healthy in my trauma, in my moments? How can I use them for the betterment in some ways, right? Like my trauma, church trauma, has actually helped create what this church is, because I didn't want that. Like what we've talked about this, but like I came from a trauma situation where a singular person was able to operate a church off their own desires. And so when we started Collectivist, I put in the bylaws that I don't have a vote. Like that was because of my trauma, right? Like I had seen that misused and abused, and though I trusted myself, I didn't trust myself. Like
what we call that?
What's that?
There's a term for that.
I love that.
It's called resilience. It's called traumatic resilience.
Oh yeah.
So that's and so I don't know if you ever had someone, especially with your loss, say, well, God's timing. I had a miscarriage or ectopic pregnancy, and well, God's timing is perfect, blah blah blah, and they make you feel like almost God
did that.
Did it?
Right. Yeah.
Whoa, I really wrestled with that, and what I came to after wrestling for years and years and years is God didn't cause that to happen, and accepting the reality and the mystery of loss and grief and brokenness, but knowing that God was with me in all of it.
Yeah.
That even when I thought he was silent and apart, that he wasn't ignoring me, he was just grieving with me.
Yes.
And when you sit with someone and they're grieving and you don't say anything, because there's nothing I can say that will make this person feel better or make this terrible thing not have happened. And God does that with us, and we feel it and we perceive it as silence, and really it's him holding space and holding us and giving us space to acknowledge the depth and the reality of that terrible thing that happened without trying to change it or fix it.
I love that God's with you. He's holding that space with you, even when he's quiet. He's not absent from it, but also him not being absent doesn't mean he's causing. And I love that.
Right.
Because we struggle with, well, if he's a sovereign God, all powerful and all good, or just all, like I know one of the big things we have to deal with those who've, it's a privilege. It's not something I'm dealing with. Those who've deconstructed, one of the biggest things coming back is, well, I can't believe that God is all powerful and that God is all good. and that we have hardships here in the world. Because he's either all good, but he's not all powerful,
do I
so he can't
reconcile
do it,
that?
right? Or he's all powerful, but he's not all good because we have power in him. And that's, again, beyond our understanding to some degree, to know that, yes, though God's quiet in your moments, quiet doesn't mean causation always, right? Like, but no, I like that.
A big something that comes up for me a lot personally in my own deconstruction and reconstruction of my faith and figuring out who I am and who God is and all this stuff, but also my mental health and working with people in mental health, is a lot of times we get to this place where we are, I don't know, being called, that sounds really big, but like where we're inevitably having to sit in mystery and uncertainty and having to learn how to tolerate that, whether it's with spiritual questions or life questions. And all these things affect our mental health. And sometimes the best thing you can do is not go do a coping skill or go, you know, whatever, but like ask someone to sit with you in that uncertainty and not be alone in it. And it seems like y'all have a community here that is working to not just tolerate, but to welcome those questions and that wrestling and the nuance and the gray. And let's all just figure this out together, and we can agree, and it can still work. And I think that type of culture and community really promotes healthy people mentally and spiritually.
And that's we say often that like your questions aren't too big for God. They might be too big for the Western church. They may break that. They won't break God, and he's good with that. And we have a safe place for those things and wrestling with that. But yes, like I think that word mystery is important within our faith to even get off, not this off mental health, but talk more spiritually on it. Like I think it is one of the things that has hurt Christianity the most is a lack of willing to have mystery. We see this theological leanings. A lot of them were decided because there was an area that we didn't know, and we had to know. Like we got to know, right? That can get if we can get our mind and hearts wrapped around that in lots of areas. I think some of our anxious minds and depressive hearts and traumatic moments can have space just to be.
Sometimes we almost like we captivate ourselves by the need to have an answer for everything. And there's a lot of freedom, though it's terrifying. I describe it as like just free falling, spiritually and mentally. But there's a lot of freedom in saying, I don't know. And I think some of the best therapists, pastors, Christian friends are the ones that are like, I don't know for sure. This is what I think and what I'm choosing to believe and what I really hope is true and what God has shown me to be true about him and about myself. But I'm going to sit here with you in it and we'll figure it out.
And me and my daughter, I have to teach her that all the time. Like, Wendy, baby, you don't have to know. Because she wants to give an answer for everything. Sometimes it leads into a misleading opinion stated as a fact, and I'm like, it's okay to say, I'm not sure. Here's what I think currently, which could change. And we say that as a church a lot, which takes faith for people to come here too, to be honest. There's lots of things like we don't have an answer for that. We do know there's parts of Scripture. The reason we have different theological splits and leanings is because Scripture is not fully clear on certain areas. And for us to say, we don't know, but hey, we can journey that together. Here's what I think at this moment. This is where I'm currently leaning. But just to even have that space to be like, I know for me, especially spiritually, that brought so much relief. Because I was a kid, I had to know. I do know what I can do. I do know my role as a believer. It doesn't make me unworried by any means, but but it does. There is still some, I don't know, a breath, a little bit of freedom that's found in being able to say, I don't know. I don't know. Doesn't change the character of who God is. Doesn't change some of the foundation of my faith. Some of it might change the foundations of my faith if they're built on incorrect foundations. But not knowing is okay. I love that. I love that. Okay. We've ended each question with something similar to this. I know the answer is similar, but what are some safe first steps someone can take to start healing trauma?
Yeah, and like we kind of said earlier, it depends on what your trauma is. And so I would say something different probably to certain people depending on what they've been through. But it's like very practical. Like if you're like, hey, I this thing happened to me, I haven't dealt with it, I want to deal with it. Like get a therapist. And the thing is, you can search on like Psychology Today. You can Google it and say therapists that specialize in trauma.
Okay.
There's different treatments for trauma that are helpful.
But trauma informed is becoming newer. So there
Yes.
are going to be some therapists that possibly haven't gone fully into that world because they've been in it for a while and maybe
Or they
trauma.
specialize in other things.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
you wouldn't
And
want
there'll be some specialists in trauma too.
Yes,
which
exactly.
my family has seen and understands that too.
So
Yes.
you wanna look for a therapist that says on their website, on their Psychology Today profile, on their Instagram that they specialize in trauma, and maybe they even have some extensive training in
Yes.
trauma, some modalities, so some ways to help people with
Yeah.
trauma.
Yeah.
That would be the first practical step.
And I want to say
take.
to families, just because this is for my family, sometimes, let me see if I can think about it. Sometimes we can have fruit that resembles other fruit, but the roots can be different, right? And so a lot of times we try to treat all fruit from what the common root often is, but trauma can, form into different types of things.
Yes.
And so on the surface, it might look like one thing, but the root could be trauma. So
Yes.
we see this, the fruit looks very similar. Like, oh, that kid just looks like my nephew but the root can be different. So we have to treat it sometimes different because of that too. And that's that nuanced world of it.
And maybe you're not sure if you have trauma, and a good therapist will be able to tell you, hey, this is actually just anxiety, or a good therapist will screen and assess you well and say, sounds like you have a history of trauma, let's start there.
Yes.
And that will address kind of your other issues.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Awesome. Thank y'all for being with us. We're going to wrap up, and we have some resources that I'm going to talk about in just a second. Thanks. Can we give God praise for Sarah? Thank you. I'm going to get somebody to bring the lights up a little bit, if you don't mind. Number one, like we expose it, we bring it to God, we talk to someone about it, find mental health professionals as well. Number two, this is our spiritual side, but also brings freedom in our life, is we have to forgive the past. The truth is, offense is a given, but how you respond to offense is a choice. Like, think about Jesus at his death. Jesus asked the Father to forgive those who were doing the trauma to him. For those who cursed him, those who nailed him to a cross, those who pierced his side, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Like, what do you mean, Jesus? They know that they're murdering a man and that they hated and made sure that he felt every bit of their malice. And they knew that they were doing this, but Jesus chose a different response to the offense. In Isaiah 54, the prophet Isaiah tells us, no weapon formed against you will prosper or prevail. Lots of people love that passage until we think deep about it. And it doesn't mean that weapons won't be formed against you. It actually is a good promise that there will be weapons formed against you, but they will not prevail. It's because it goes on to say, and you can refute every tongue that accuses you. This is hard work, but it's a reminder that hard lessons will end better than if we avoid them. And then number three, walk in freedom. Walk in freedom. As we release our offenders, we in turn find true freedom. Joseph didn't rush to reconciliation, but he also didn't avoid it either. He tested his brother's repentance. He made peace, not because they deserved it, but because he was already free and he didn't want to be held captive by his trauma anymore. Paul says to the church of Rome, don't take revenge, my dear friends. That's how we want to respond to these moments. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And the results, the worship team, come on up. God has a beautiful future, even from a broken beginning. Think about Joseph's story. It ends in redemption, but not just for himself. It actually, his healing led to the saving of a nation. And when you begin to heal from trauma, your story becomes hope, not just for your life, but for the others and for future generations. That's why he said, so then, don't be afraid, my brothers. I will provide for you and your children. Because of what's happened, I will leverage it for the generation to come. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. How could Joseph do this? Well, he did it because he knew it was for his good and for God's glory. Augustine of Hippo, early church father, says this. I love this quote. In my deepest wound, I saw your glory, and it dazzled me. In John chapter 20, there's a story of a man named Thomas, one of Jesus's followers. And Thomas saw Jesus killed. He had this traumatic moment where he watched him be pierced for his transgressions. He saw him hanging on a cross. He saw him breathe his last breath. He heard all the words that came from Jesus' lips, and then the silence of his death. Trauma caused Thomas to not believe the good news. Later, Jesus was resurrected, appeared to the disciples up in an upper room. Thomas wasn't there, and they saw him, and then the disciples later told Thomas, man, you should have seen it. Jesus is alive, and Thomas says, I don't believe you. I don't believe you, and I won't believe you unless I can touch the nails that I watched drive through his hand. Talk about trauma. He's thinking back, like I watched nails go through his hand. I watched spears pierce his side. I watched a crown of thorns go in his head. I watched him breathe his last breath. I watched them take him all down off the cross. I watched them put him in a tomb that wasn't even his tomb. And now you're telling me he's alive? Like, get over it. It's not true. But Jesus, in his great kindness and mercy, this is not theology, nor is it in the Bible, but I believe it with my heart that Jesus then just made this special trip for Thomas. Again, that's just my theory. That's not a theology. You don't have to believe that. You can read scripture. But Jesus appears again to the disciples in that same space, but there's something that's different. Guess who's there? Thomas is there. And he says, Thomas, he doesn't look at him and go, what's wrong with you, man? He says, put your hands here. Put it here. Like you have a blessed moment right now that you get to see what had happened and get to see the redemption of it. But blessed are those who don't see the end of it and still believe. My daughter, Wendy, I've told this story before, but she used to have a fascination with Band-Aids because our Band-Aids used to have Disney princesses on them. And so she wore them all over her body, and she called them Band-Aids. I don't know why, but it was cute. And one day she would always come up to me like, I need a Band-Aid. And eventually I taught her, like, baby, these aren't stickers. These go on sores that are, when you get hurt, they help them heal. And so then she would search her body for any mark that used to be a hurt, right? And she'd be like, I need a Band-Aid. And I'm like, baby, you don't need a Band-Aid. And I'm like, Ben, don't say Band-Aid. It's Band-Aid. Don't need a Band-Aid. And she would find things. And eventually I had to say, baby, these spots, they may resemble something that's happened, but they're healed. You don't need Band-Aids on those. Can I tell you, many of us are covering up our wounds and our hurts of our past when they need to be exposed. Why? Because think about Jesus. He came, and in his healing, he still had holes in his hands. He still had a pierced side. And this was not just for healing of Thomas, but for the healing of all of us. And when we let our hurts be visible in his resurrection and in his healing, we're not only exposing the wounds that led to this, but we're bringing healing as well. Trauma may shape your path, but it doesn't have to define your future. The scars of your past hurt, and they are forming a path, but it doesn't have to lead to future pain, and it could lead to healing of not just you, but a generation to come. So here's what we're going to do as we end. We have 3 quick things we're going to do. We're going to worship an abbreviated song together because I think we need a time to respond to the word. I'll be available for prayer. I'll have Dee available for prayer up here. You can just use your seat as an altar if you want. You can come up and use this as an altar. You can just take a moment just to come before the Lord. At the end of that, we're going to pray over some of the next generation, the seniors, send them out, and then I'm going to give you a blessing and some announcements as we leave. So if you would, why don't you just stand with me together and we'll just pray.